our live virtual event with Beth Piatote, author of The Beadworkers, and Sameer Pandya, author of Members Only. I'm Lane Jacobson, the owner of Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon. And before we really get into things, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping and tech reminders. This event is brought to you by Books in Common Northwest, an event series that we put together alongside with Madison Books in Seattle and Country Bookshelf in Bozeman. The event is being recorded, and afterwards you can view the recording by going to booksincommonnw.com or visiting the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel. There is a link to buy your copy of both authors' books in the chat, and we'll be dropping that link back into the chat throughout the event. If you have any questions for the authors, you can click the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them as time allows. You can also see the questions that other folks have asked and vote on which questions you'd most like to hear the answer to. And you can leave comments in the chat window to the right. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend you first try exiting and re-entering the webinar. And if you can't sort out whatever issue you're running into, we recommend just going to the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel where the event is being streamed live right now. And for any audio issues, we recommend just plugging in some headphones, usually does the trick. And we would also like to remind everyone that this is a shared creative space, and we ask that everybody be respectful of everyone else who has joined us tonight. Offensive comments and or questions will see the user dismissed from the event. And a last reminder also about some other exciting events that we have coming up. We've got Jess Walter, author of Beautiful Ruins, will be presenting his new book, The Cold Millions, and will be in conversation with Sarah Vowell. We've also got Cassandra Tate and Jane Kirkpatrick in conversation, as well as Pam Houston and Amy Irvine presenting their new book, Airmail, among some others. So do please go to booksincommonnw.com and check out our event calendar. And with all that out of the way, I would like to introduce our authors for the evening. Beth Piatote is an associate professor of Native American Studies at UC Berkeley. She holds a PhD from Stanford University, is the author of numerous scholarly essays and creative works, and is the recipient of multiple awards and fellowships. She is Nez Perce enrolled with the Colville Confederated Tribes and lives in the Bay Area with her 2 children. Sameer Pandya was longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award for his story collection, The Blind Writer, and is the recipient of the PEN Civitella Fellowship. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Salon, and elsewhere. He teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And without further ado, I'm just going to pass it off to our authors, and I will be back in 30, 40 minutes to take some questions from the audience.
Lane, thank you so much, Lane. We really
Thank you, Lane.
Really appreciate it. Hi, Beth. How are you?
Hi, great. How are you, Sameer?
Doing very well. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to put up your lovely book, and kind of for everyone who is kind of watching out there, please go buy this book. You know, it is a terrific book, and I have all sorts of questions, and I encourage you, for folks who are out there, to please kind of write in your questions as well. I wanted to start off, Beth, you know, just for those of you who are out there, you know, Beth and I met in 2001 when I was finishing graduate school, and Beth was just starting graduate school in a interdisciplinary humanities program called Modern Thought and Literature, where kind of the idea of the program was to bring together the humanities and the social sciences. And why I'm so particularly excited about this conversation is that, you know, unbeknownst to Beth and I think in some ways we've had kind of very similar intellectual journeys, right? Where we are trained as literary and cultural studies scholars and kind of interdisciplinary scholars. And yet I think both of us in one way or another have had this interest, this desire, this inkling to write fiction. Beth, you know, your first book is, of course, this kind of is a scholarly monograph, and now you've moved on to this collection of stories. And so let's just begin with, how do you navigate these two things, right? And partly what I mean by navigating is particularly in terms of your expertise as a Native American literature scholar and as a practitioner, right? That there's all sorts of stuff going on. So I want to hear about kind of what your road was to getting to these two books, and how you are kind of managing the two parts of your thinking that produces these two different kinds of texts.
Oh, thank you, Sameer. And I hope that you will also answer that question too. But
Yeah.
let me take a first stab at it. Yeah, I actually started my career after undergrad as a journalist. And so I was a reporter for a number of years before I went to graduate school. And that's where I really was thinking about form and story. And then going into graduate school and studying literary forms, I think that I just began to see the possibilities of a world in which you could always match the topic that you were writing to the form that you were interested in working with. And I think a lot of people who go to graduate school find scholarly writing is just all encompassing, and that becomes like their entire writing life. But I think because I had these other experiences, and because I always wrote for myself, I always, have always kept a journal. I've always been writing little stories and sometimes poems. And I always kept my writing, sort of my multifaceted writing life going. And so I had to place creative writing in a secondary role through graduate school, and then through the first 6 years of my life on the tenure track. I had to really focus on scholarship and scholarly writing, but I also just saw scholarly writing as a genre with a particular set of conventions and possibilities. And at the same time, I tried to keep my creative writing life alive, and I was chipping away on these stories on the side. And so I think from the outside, sometimes people say, oh, how did you go from being a scholar to being a creative writer? And I was like, well, I actually had my little short story factory in the basement the whole time, while I was doing this. And it wasn't until, after I got tenure that then I shifted my attention to saying, well, my next book is going to be a book of creative works. And just as a matter of self-preservation, and I'm sure that you're very familiar with how, it's very obvious in your book that you're very familiar with how the reward structures of academia work. I did publish some short stories and other creative works on the way, and I never sort of hid the fact that I was doing creative work, because if you kind of pull that out without any sort of ground laid for that, that can have some really negative effects on your career to do that. So that's what I did. I sometimes talk about my writing lives as like Rachel and Leah. You work the first 7 years and then you work the next 7 years. So now I feel like I'm going to stay the course and continue to write creatively as the main part of my career and make scholarship secondary.
Yeah. Sorry, continue.
No, I was going to say, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, before I give you my answer, actually it is this interesting thing, right? Which is, there are these two things that struck me about what you were saying, right? Which is that you kept the creative material in the basement and that you had to hide a certain kind of aspect of kind of the work that you were doing, right? Which is that there is, in a way, those are the realities of the work that you do, right? That is a kind of a part of it. I guess the follow-up question I had, did you resent your scholarship?
No, I didn't. And I think it's partly because I really like doing that.
Yeah.
And I also feel like, and I think this must be true for you too, that being a literary scholar is a great complement to being a writer, because basically you're getting paid to study and analyze the work of great writers. And I think also something that was very grounding for me is that the field that I developed my expertise in is actually late 19th century, early 20th century Native writers.
Mhm.
And looking at those early writers and thinking about the print culture of the 19th century, where there's a proliferation of print venues and public performance venues, but also that public intellectuals would write across genres. So like Du Bois is very famous for the soul of Black folk and his sociological writing, but he also wrote some novels, you know, and he was out on the Chautauqua series, and so was Charles Eastman and these other early Native writers. They were performing in movies, they were speaking in pageants and you know, big social events. They were writing short stories, they were writing political commentaries. They just wrote whatever the situation called for. And I think I just rooted myself in that same intellectual tradition, saying, well, I'm going to write what the situation calls for.
Yeah. No, yeah, The Dark Princess, which is a book, the Du Bois novel that I've had.
Oh, it's about India.
Exactly. Like I've been wanting to somehow, I mean, that his Dark Princess is an Indian princess. And so I've been kind of wanting to it's so interesting, right? Which is this idea that in some ways the way, if in a contemporary moment, if there are these really strict kind of rules about kind of the lines that separate genre and rhetoric, I think part of what you're saying in an earlier moment, these folks were doing it in all of these different various venues, right? That you could kind of argue that there's a similar kind of idea, and that idea was being proliferated in kind of dramatically, in a scholarly way. And even, you know, Souls of Black Folk is such a kind of, has such a kind of a poetic kind of nature to the writing itself, right? It's so deeply kind of analytically on point, but you can also see Du Bois, a writer, very much present in the way in which he writes about that history. But you know, I with my kind of relationship to it is that, you know, I came in to graduate school to study South Asian literature, right? And I think I came in at a time in the mid to late 90s where kind of the South Asian novel had become, it was like the version of the Latin American boom, right? Like all of these really big famous, you know, Rushdie and Arundhati Roy and Amitav Ghosh, all these big kind of novels were coming out, right? And so that was a kind of a part of my experience that, you know, I had to, I think just like you, I didn't write during kind of graduate school at all, right? Like I did a little bit here or there, but it was always a kind of a balancing act, right? Because it's just at that point when you're trying to write that first book, you just don't have the bandwidth to be able to do both of those things. And you don't necessarily have the bandwidth, and also you don't have the kind of the confidence, or at least I didn't have the confidence to say, you know what, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do this, right? Like that is, in some ways, that's just a kind of a confidence you gain out of kind of succeeding at these things, and then also in some ways at failing at them, right? To say, okay, this didn't work, I will try it again. But, you know, for me, I've just enjoyed it because I think exactly as you're saying, I get to teach and research on this material that I love, right? And I to think about, and yet kind of at the same time then kind of have this opportunity to do the practice, right? To do the work of kind of how all of this works. It's in that context, kind of the second question that I had was something that you talked a little bit about earlier, right? Which is that what I was really impressed with the Beadworkers was the way in which you engage with form, right? And kind of the form of the, you know, so that there's a way in which I think that the traditional kind of book of short stories, you know, has, you know, 9 stories, right? And there's a certain kind of trajectory, and then it moves forward until you get to the kind of the long story at the end, right? And I think in some ways, like Dubliners by Joyce is probably the perfect example of this series of short stories, and then suddenly the dead, and, you know, he encapsulates all of the universe of Dublin kind of in 70 amazing pages. You have kind of, you've you kind of presented this in a slightly different way, in the sense that there's this kind of fascinating incantation to start and a play to end, and then the middle has these kind of series of what we might call traditional short stories. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how you put this book together?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I do. I did feel like the book was kind of a playground of form. And I do think like that. I do just love form so much. And I think that the way the book came together is very much about the circumstances under which I was writing.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have any shape of a book in mind. I would just think of a story I wanted to write, and I'd start writing it and try to, and it was just like, my only thought was I need to produce enough pages to make a book and then figure out how they could possibly be related. Because there are lots of ways in which the stories are very disparate, like not only in form, but just in content. And so for a long time, I was like, what am I going to do with this one story that's set in like 1890? Like with all these contemporary stories, like I don't, and so I think the fact that I was just writing each story as it was coming to me, and it was kind of in the background of my life that I was just going along, and I was playing with these ideas. So I didn't realize this until I completed the book and didn't have an agent and didn't have any way to get it published, that what I had experienced was an experience of pure artistic freedom. Mm-hmm. So it was like, when I got to that point, I realized, oh, nobody was expecting this book. Nobody has any idea what it should look like or what it should be. And so when I put it all together, it did look unlike other books. And at first I was very worried about that. And I went through a year of rejections, and even like a year of being rejected by agents. Mm-hmm. And, the way things work, you can't really get to a publisher without an agent. And so those rejections were the ones I was experiencing the most. And just through really good fortune, I was able to get this book onto an editor's desk, and then it was selected. And a week after my book got accepted, I got accepted by an agent. It was just like, I was like, well, yay. And yet, so speaking of form, I was really inspired by Maori poet Robert Sullivan, who said we should be using our indigenous aesthetics in our writing. And I thought, wow, what would that be? And so what happened is, like that opening triptych, I decided to use the structure of a feast, a Nez Perce feast, as the structure of these three interrelated pieces. And the pieces are different genres. There's a poem and kind of a prose poem, and then a narrative short story. But they all have the exact same structure, and it's the structure of the feast, which always begins and ends with kus, with water, and then salmon, natsoch, and going through all the first foods. And this is sort of the order of the universe for Plateau people. Is the order of the feast is the everything begins and ends with water. Then it's the animals as they offered themselves to humans, and then the plants and the roots and the berries as they appear in the order in the landscape. Mm-hmm. And so there are all of these temporal dimensions and these sort of elements of the feast that are also tied into traditional stories and spiritual beliefs about the order of the world. But this was the structure of these pieces. And to me, that was like drawing on an indigenous form, which would be recognizable to somebody from the plateau, but might not be recognizable to anyone else. But I thought it is a sturdy structure. And so if readers will go into it, they will be held by this form. The form will work. So that was probably my most overt sort of experimentation with indigenous aesthetic. then I've also been studying Nez Perce language for almost 20 years and reading Nez Perce stories and translating them. And so there are a lot of references to some of those traditional stories, and I draw on certain elements of those stories and weave them into mine. So like the dominance of the number 5 is shows up a lot in the stories because that comes from those old stories. And then things like the idea of the limute, of the youngest one being the hero, that was sort of the launching idea for the story Falling Crows. Like, well, I'm going to write a contemporary story in which the limute, the youngest one, is the hero. And so that's where that is embedded. And also in that same story, Falling Crows, I was also trying to imitate the structure of the language, of the Nez Perce language in English. So Nez Perce is a polysynthetic language, which means words are actually sentences. There's a verb in the middle, and the prefixes are the who and the how, and the suffixes are the when and the where. And so you have one word is an entire sentence. So I tried to imitate the rhythmic structure of that in that story in English. So those are some of the ways in which I tried to bring indigenous aesthetics and forms into these stories.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Which is in some ways, I feel now a little sheep. I don't know if I use the word or not, but in fact, you're not experimenting with form. You're in fact, I mean, you are experimenting with form, but you are saying the other argument that you're making is that in fact, there are these forms that are already embedded and that I'm simply now utilizing them in a way that they've not been utilized before, or they've not been utilized in this context. Of course, they've been utilized in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of different storytelling traditions, but that is kind of what's interesting, right? So that when that a part of the kind of the reality of publishing is that you have to create a book that says, you know, the Beadworkers stories, right? It's a form that readers recognize. And once they enter the book, they are in fact, what happens is you feel kind of, you know, in some ways you're kind of entered into a kind of a form that you're not entirely sure of what's going on if you do not know the tradition from which it comes from, right? And so I thought that was, you know, it was kind of both the way that you're talking about it, right? That both an experiment that you're doing, but it's also an argument that you're making is that these aesthetics are established aesthetics. All I'm simply doing is I'm utilizing them in the world that I exist in, right? In this kind of hybrid space that you've created in here. That sounds like a happy dog.
I'm sorry, my dog.
It's good, as long as it just sounds like happiness, not sadness. So, you know, in the context of this, right, which is in the context of how you were just talking about form and aesthetics, the other thing that I really admire about this book is the way in which, and please kind of correct me if I'm wrong, that you fight an ethnographic instinct in this book, right? Where that there is, you know, occasion where you may or may not feel like you have to explain, you have to translate, right? In kind of not just the form that you're working in with, but also the particular kind of moments within the text of kind of what is happening with different characters, the different kind of like lives that they're leading. But at the same time, I also think you're a kind of terrific ethnographer in the sense that you are very specific about the details that you are giving us, right? So that there is this kind of interesting balance that you're doing, which is you're writing a very specific book about a very specific group of people, and yet fighting an instinct to say, if you don't recognize these specific groups of people, let me explain to you who they are and why they are. So I guess my question is, can you talk a little bit about the work of translation that you think this book is doing, and the work of translation that in some ways you refuse to do, right? Like, how do those two aspects of this book work together?
Wow, that's such a great, I think when I think about the kinds of translations that are required, maybe it's because I'm in California, and I think that the book is so oriented toward the Northwest. And I think that there's even this sort of larger, sort of more general translation of thinking about Native people moving through these various locations of Native culture. So going from Portland to the reservation, going out to gather roots, working in the fields in Yakima, like these are, going to the San Francisco, American Indian Film Festival, like all of these are very old routes that are, Nez Perce people have been taking. And so I think when Tommy Orange's book came out, there was sort of like this, oh, there are Native people in urban settings. And there's also this great circuit of people going in and out. And if you look closely at Tommy Orange's book, you see that circuit going. And of course, writers, there's a long tradition of Native writers, 150 years or more of them writing about these circuits of Native people moving in and out. And I think that that's almost like more of a translation than some of these other elements.
Yeah. Can I want to go back actually to, I meant to ask you about it, and then kind of we moved on to something else, is about that year where you were getting no's from agents. Can you talk about that year a little bit, in the sense that was this a moment where you're like, your no is fine, my work is fine, right? Or was it, okay, this is kind of what's happening, let me see if I can shift this around? And I want to kind of hear your thoughts on this. And then kind of once you're done, I have a kind of a follow-up question to that as well, is because this is in some ways a part of the practical aspects of publishing fiction when kind of you're publishing a particular kind of fiction. So tell us about, give me, I'd love to hear a sense of what that year looked like for you.
Yeah, it was hard. Mm-hmm. It was hard. I mean, because you have these hopes, and it's hard for me, it was realizing that there was a path and I didn't know what it was. I realized how naive I'd been, like, oh, I'll just write these stories. And after I've written them, I'll find a place to publish them. And that's not actually, I've learned, how most things move into the market and move into distribution. And I think I just had all this faith in, like, well, once there's a book, then it will find a place. And I actually ended up having some different options in the end. But I think that year of rejection was also, on top of discouragements that happened in the process of writing itself. And I think that there had been so many times of coming to the point of going, I don't know if this is going to work, or I don't know why I'm doing this. And then you sort of come to that point where you're like, well, am I going to keep going, or am I going to stop? And every time I'd come to that impasse, I would say, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep going. And so I think that would always happen with the agent rejections too. It's like, okay, they said no. Am I going to stop? Or am I going to keep going? Well, you cry first, and then am I going to stop? And so I think that's kind of the cycle that it just keeps coming around to. It's like, you always end up with one of two options, to stop or keep going. And I just have always felt compelled to keep going. And I think part of my motivation is to write to and for Native people. Mm-hmm. And I think I really want Native people to read this book and not feel lonely. And I realized, like, this was a main motivation that I had, like, I'm going to write this so that other Native people don't feel lonely. And then I realized, like, oh, I feel lonely. It's me. I want to be in this world where I have all these companions who are experiencing things, confronting history, and going through these experiences that are similar. But I need to ask you some questions too, Sameer, because I think Lane is coming back on in a couple minutes.
Ask away.
Okay, I want to talk to you about structure too.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to say I love members only, and I'm sorry it's on my coffee table. I'd have to run down there,
They're all good.
quiet, grab the book, and come back up here. Maybe Lane will hold up a picture, because Members Only is an amazing book. It is doing so well, and for every good reason. And one of the things that I loved, the narrative voice, I loved the structure. I thought the structure was so brilliant, this novel that played out across a week. Thinking about the structure and the critique that the book is giving about the complicated structures of race and class, I felt like one of the things that happened in the book is early on, there's this very cringy moment that happens to the narrator that doesn't get resolved. And so there's this forward movement of the narrative through the days, and each day there are these more and more imperiling things, but you can't get out of your mind that thing that's in the background that's unresolved.
Yeah.
So to me, this seemed like such a beautiful expression, or such a brilliant expression of how race and racial consciousness operates. You have this forward movement where you can kind of see the structures as the narrator is moving from them. But then there's always this thing still, I don't know what the right word is. I want to say lurking, but just suspended there, unresolved. And I just want to hear you talk about that a little bit, because I just found that so compelling.
Yeah. No, I have, you know this experience. You put out a book, and you get certain questions that come up often, right? And I think that one of the questions, this has come up often, right? So, Raj Bhatt, who's my narrator, says something, and it's something, cringy is such a great word because it's come up so often, and I've kind of, in some ways, I would love to kind of take a moment to think about what the aesthetics of cringe is, and what that kind of, that feeling it produces, right? But, one of the questions, he says something really racially inappropriate, and one of the kind of concerns readers have had is, why doesn't he apologize immediately, right? Why doesn't it happen kind of as quickly as it needs to happen, right? And there is, I think the point you're making here is such a fascinating one, right? Which is that a part of the point of my book is that this notion that apologies will fix what needs to be fixed is kind of a falsity, right? That in essence, the request for an apology is a band-aid to kind of cover up a wound that is deeply festered and festering, right? And I think that there is a way in which this experience of, I think the word I was thinking of when you were describing it was that it's haunting, right? Like there's a kind of a ghostly spectral vision or presence of this thing that is there, right? And I think a part of what I was thinking about or trying to work through was that, a simple apology will take care of something in the short run, but there is a way in which Raj does not get to kind of, derobe these kind of racial structures that he exists in, right? That they are going to be with him. He is walking through them constantly, right? And that even when the week ends, right, which is the novel starts on a Sunday and then ends on a Friday with an epilogue, it doesn't magically go away, right? That haunting is in some ways a very much a point of the book, right? Which is that it is what kind of Raj has. It is kind of, and part of kind of what the exploration for me in this book was particularly what kind of that brown haunting looks like, right? Like that, what is this kind of space where, he passes until he doesn't. And when he stops passing, what happens, right? Like what happens when that kind of charade that he has created for himself and that people around him have engaged in disappears. That's kind of where that kind of exploration was. So it is this kind of this interesting thing, right? Which is, as readers, you want it to be resolved, but I think a part of the point that I think I was digging at was, yeah, we can apologize and Raj will eventually apologize, but there is a lot more stuff that's going on there that is going to continue past the week of this story.
Well, and I mean, that's so brilliant. And I also feel like that if the apology had happened, that would have been like instant reassurance and, you know, as you say, sort of this surface like reparation.
Yeah.
And what I think is one of the things that's so beautiful about that space that opens up for Raj's introspection and rumination is also such an exploration of his desires. There are so many passages that have to do with the way he fantasizes about playing tennis and having these, I mean, he actually plays tennis too, but there are these ideas of camaraderie and connection that come out in sort of the exploration of why did this thing happen. I also felt that the way that you wrote about the Raj's position at the university and being sort of attacked by students, that was very, very real and harrowing. Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is like the desire for the apology can't be separated from also a desire to foreclose knowing more about what that space between those two men is.
Yeah, no, that in some ways, I think, you know, part on a very practical level, Raj is scared to apologize because what he needs to do is he needs to make it's a big apology, right? There are gradations of apology, right? I apologize when I cut someone off on the road mistakenly. Mm-hmm. And I'm over the affective pain of that very quickly, right? But mm-hmm. What the depth of the mistake that Raj has made, the depth of the mistake that Raj has made kind of to this particular person, I think, as you say, that he desires so much, right? That he envies so much, that he sees as in some ways a fix to these problems that he's gotten himself into, right? And so in a way, I think part of it is that there is this kind of almost fear that he has. But I think what I tried to do, and I think I always appreciated when others kind of articulate what I often have trouble articulating, which is it opens up a narrative space where he can actually then explore every aspect of kind of how he has gotten where he has gotten, right? Like, I think that becomes a central part of it, right? And of course, I mean, the glib answer to this is that if he apologizes quickly, then it's a short story. And I desperately wanted to write a novel, and so that is just like I know Raj needs to apologize, but I really want to try for 350 pages this time, you know. And I think that was, you know, in terms of form, that was very much a part of my thinking as well.
Well, it's an amazing novel, and your narrator is just a wonderful companion through all the through all the events of this very eventful week. It was just
I appreciate
on everybody's gift list for the holiday season.
No, I appreciate you saying that, and I think part of it is that I think, and kind of Lane has questions for us, but I just wanted to circle back that, you know, part of, you know, we began our conversation, Beth, in terms of talking about our respective kind of pasts, starting in graduate school, and now both of us existing in kind of these university spaces, right? And I sat down, one of the first things I thought about in writing this book was I wanted to write a campus novel, and a campus novel that reflects the campuses that you and I know intimately, that are often not the campuses that end up appearing on and I love campus novels, right?
Yeah.
But the campus has changed, and I wanted to reflect some of those changes. So
Mhm.
thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. What do you have for us, Lane?
Yeah, well, I guess a couple different questions, but since it kind of came up, the idea, we talked a little bit about, Beth, your book being kind of artistic freedom and just kind of, playing with different forms, and touched on, Sameer, yours being set over the course of a week, and you having like this idea of where it was going to be set. And a lot of this, the action, I guess, takes place at this tennis club. And I'm curious if you felt why did you choose, did you know when you started writing the book that it was going to be set over a week and be kind of, I don't want to say small in scale, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. Time is a really hard thing to pull off, right? And I think that is in all the pages that I have thrown out over the years, that I have found that the swift, smooth movement of temporality across a book is really hard to pull off, right? So in some ways, it's really hard to pull off kind of a novel that covers 30 years. And it's really hard to pull off a novel that covers one day, right? Both of those forms have their own deep challenges, right? I started off I wrote this kind of story that's the first chapter of this book. And suddenly I was just like, what if it takes place in a week, right? Like there was nothing, I had not thought through it. I had kind of where I was working when I drafted this book. I just had a corkboard that was kind of that was right over my desk. And I put 6 blank pieces of paper kind of on that corkboard. And on the first one, I wrote Sunday. And then before I quite knew it, I was like, oh, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I would, like, every time I thought of something, I'd be like, oh, this works for Wednesday, right? So I would like to say, like, I had some grand kind of temporal idea in mind about the week. But sometimes, the kinds of stuff we come up with is way more banal than that, right? Like you're just like, oh, this is something. The one other thing I wanted to say about that is I did want to create a certain breathlessness to the book. And I think a week helped me do that. A day was just too short, right? That there are too many, to create the 2 narrative strands that I wanted to create. I think the week just kind of felt a little bit better to do.
And really, for both of you, that segues nicely into just a question about kind of your writing process. Do you have one that you stick with religiously, or is it kind of just all over the place? I was listening to Robert Jones Jr., who has a novel coming out in January, and he was talking about writing this big, sweeping, epic novel on the subway, jammed between a couple people, and I can't imagine. I can hardly imagine writing at all, but writing in that context seems difficult to me. So, Sameer, do you have thoughts on that?
Beth, you want to go first? I want to hear your kind of what your kind of writing kind of routines are like, and I'm happy to add on.
Well, mine is very straightforward, and I started doing this in graduate school. Actually, I always write in my journal first thing in the morning, just for a page or whatever. And then when I'm writing something, I sort of bid the job every day. I'm going to write between 100 and 300 words. And that's what I do. I do that first. And then when I reach my word count, I stop and do the rest of my job. And that's how I write everything.
I am a huge, huge proponent of first thing in the morning, before the telephone, before kind of all of that madness. We have a couple of kids who are now a little bit older, but for a while when they were young and their kind of wake up times were inconsistent, like I found the sanctity of 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. to be a really lovely thing. I wish I could write late at night, but the nighttime kind of scares me, if I'm completely honest. And there's always something about working really early in the morning where you're working and it is dark, and then at the end of your work, like the sun comes out, which is kind of a nice thing to have. But I think as Beth is saying, is the consistency of doing it, right? Like to know. And, Beth, I'm curious, I'm so happy to hear you said between 100 and 300 words, because when people think of, when you do that count, that's like one double spaced page, correct? Are you able to stick to that?
Yeah, I mean, life fluctuates so much. And so like one page is like best case scenario.
Yeah.
But sometimes I just think it's better to write 100 words and do it consistently than to skip, because to do 300 words would be overwhelming. So if I know I have a super crowded day, then I'm like, I'm gonna write 100 words and have a successful day and move on. Because keeping that sort of steady attention, that's like, I don't know what they say, but like keeping it on the back burner or something, like you keep thinking of things during the day. So then you have something to write the next day. And if you go over 300, you don't, I never go over much, but yeah, things eventually get done that way. And the jazz musician Ed Blackwell said, if you ignore your art for one day, it will ignore you for two.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really good advice, so just do it every day.
And I feel, I honestly think it is, I feel just better having sat there and done it, right? It's like, it's the same feeling I have creatively that I have if I've exercised, right?
Yeah.
Like your body just feels better. You don't have as much nervous energy. And I feel I have way less nervous energy if, because for me, even kind of bad 100 words or 100 words that I'm going to get rid of is in some ways like a balm to the possibility that the rest of the day will not go well, right? So even if the rest of the day does not go well, that I teach a poor class or I don't do everything I expected myself to do, the memory of that hour and a half will kind of get me through. And so it is, I don't know, you do all these mental gymnastics to make yourself kind of do the work and then to feel good about the work. And I think the consistency, that thing about it ignoring you for 2 days, there's nothing like the fear of that to keep you going day after day. I'll remember that.
And while we're on the subject, a question from the audience. And Beth, also, I think you have a background a little bit, I don't know how long ago, but as a journalist as well. So tie this in a little bit, but for both of you, what elements or skills of scholarly writing do you feel translate well to creative writing? And what's the most different aspect or challenge switching gears?
Both Sameer and I have discussed our attachment to history as well as literature. And I think being able to think about how historical forces foreclose certain choices. I think just this part of academia that is wonderful is its pursuit of complexity and conditions, trying to understand conditions under which things happen or don't happen. And I think always wanting to peel back what is known. And so in a way, it's like a posture and also just basic research skills and, going to an archive or, finding little gems in everyday things. I think my background as a reporter really helped me a lot, just to listen to and record how people talk about things, to think about story form, and also to accept imperfection. to accept the partial knowledge that we have in writing, and also the sort of partial stories we live with every day. I think all those things have been really useful for me.
No, I mean, it is, I think, I mean, I think Beth, what she was saying is spot on, right? Which is that there is a way in which I am interested in kind of the historical narratives that I've read, right? And then to think about how those narratives kind of will possibly or not possibly shape these characters you end up creating, right? But there is I think one of these like phrases, I think, from the literary critic Raymond Williams that's always struck with me, right? Which this notion of structure of feeling, right? Which is that these characters are embedded in these structures of feeling of a particular moment, right? And I think that, Beth and I went to graduate school at a time where in some ways this relationship between the moment and kind of the work that is produced in that moment was such a kind of central part of how we thought about the literary text, right? That it is not kind of something that sits on its own, that it is a part of a much larger web of conversations. And I think that that's in some ways, that part of my scholarly training has always shaped the way in which I think about writing fiction, right? Which is that you go very specific with these characters, but you also realize that each of these characters live in a world, that they have a job, they have a bank account, or they don't have a bank account, right? All of these kind of become a central way in which you end up constructing these characters. I think someone had advised me, I mean, in college, you end up writing these short stories. And I think I had a teacher in college who said, your characters have to have jobs. Like none of your characters seem to have jobs. They just seem to kind of go through life. And that struck with me, right? Which is, in fact, that like when you're in college, you end up writing stories, even if it's not about college students, of people just kind of moving through life in different kinds of ways. So I think all of these things stick with you in different ways.
Definitely. So changing gears a bit here, Beth, is it Antigone? Is that okay? You reimagine the Greek story of Antigone within the indigenous context, and I'm just curious about your inspiration for that, and also if you have any thoughts on the idea of just kind of stories and myth transcending culture and language, and also not by being limited and living within a certain language, which I think, obviously language and the Nez Perce language plays such an important role in the Beadworkers. And Sameer, if you have thoughts on that also with mythologies and all that, please.
Oh, thank you for that question. So I read Sophocles' Antigone as a ninth grader, this little high school in Idaho. I loved that story. I loved it. And then it came to my mind when the Ancient One, or Kennewick Man, was pulled out of the Columbia River in 1996 and instantly became this very contested human remain that then was caught up in the Smithsonian and the Burke Museum and sort of, out of Native hands for like 20 years. And when this happened at that time, I remembered Antigone and I said, what is wrong with this culture? Like, don't they even read their own stories? These very questions: what do the living owe the dead? What are eternal laws compared to state laws? What is worth the sacrifice, right? Who are we related to? To whom do we owe our allegiance? Like, all of these great themes from Sophocles, where I felt just on full display in this conflict over Kennewick Man. So I had the idea in 1996, just while I was reading the morning paper. But I never thought like, well, I actually tried to write some sort of like short story treatments of this, and they were kind of like, N.E.H. Grant on the reservation to, stage the classics. And then these other themes start coming out. Or, the Native Student Union is protesting the museum, but then some of their students are also in the play. Like there were these different kinds of treatments that didn't ever really take off. And then I came to UC Berkeley, which the Hearst Museum has the largest holding of ancestral remains outside of the Smithsonian. More than 9,000 ancestors are held here at Berkeley. And I thought, I'm going to set it here, right in this museum, dealing with this problem. But I decided to make all the main characters native because I didn't want to I felt like it would have been too easy and too easy to dismiss if it were just like white colonial administrators and sort of native people, because then you have the same sort of struggle. You have the same moral struggle, like Creon's clearly bad, Antigone's clearly right. But what I wanted to show was how being caught in a colonial situation means that everybody could have the same commitment. Everyone can agree, we want our ancestors out of the museums, but people have different tactics. And, you know, the native person who seems to have the most power in the story still does not have the most power in the overall structure. And so by changing it into this other setting and having it into an internal conflict, it was also about how like Indian policy and colonialism makes families tear each other apart because they differ, even though they have the same orientations, they have different tactics toward those ends. And to me, it seemed like, well, this could play out for any political movement, right? Any political movement in which there's some overriding power. You can have this internal fighting because people differ on having the like absolute stance or the moderate stance, you know, and this is how power works in these situations. And so the amazing thing that happened to me as I started creating this chorus of aunties who tell coyote stories and other traditional stories, is that the moral center of the play moved so that the Antigone figure is not the most morally pure person, and neither is Creon the most morally bad person. Their positions get much more muddy, and you can see how they're caught in this colonial situation. And so the moral center moves into the aunties and sort of the drum. The drum is also a character in the play. And so I felt that was a very interesting thing to see happen. I didn't anticipate that going into it. And the last thing I'd say about that, about language and stories, is that I love those Greek stories. They're amazing. And as I was reading this, I really only read one translation of Antigone, of Sophocles, and sort of used that to think about, okay, what's happening in this scene. I read one set of commentaries and based my writing on that. So in the original, there's a great deal of wordplay and puns in the Greek. And so I also tried to imitate that in my writing and in using Nez Perce, but also a particular kind of wordplay in English that would imitate the Greek. I also wanted these Nez Perce stories to be seen as sort of equally powerful myth stories as those Greek stories. Like, here are two great intellectual traditions in conversation. And actually reading those old passages of the Greek choruses, I was like, if these storytellers ever met each other, they would be staying up all night telling these crazy, gruesome, sexual, like totally crazy, messed up stories about the cosmos. Like, there's so much similarity in the structures of these stories. So all of that was a great discovery for me. I actually have one more tiny thing to say, and that is that one of the languages that comes out in that play is the language of federal Indian law and policy. And you see it in the intimate conversations that happen between Antigone, particularly, and Creon. When their most painful and intimate conversations with each other, they are both invoking Native history and particularly laws that have dispossessed Native people and accusing each other of doing that to the other one. And that the ways in which Indian history and law becomes the intimate language of Indian families in a fight. Like, I think that's also a very important sort of element of discourse. I can't believe I said element of discourse. I apologize.
Of course you did. That's good. Lynn, can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really a follow-up. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Because I think in this hour-long conversation we've had, you clearly, the enthusiasm you were kind of bringing to, that you brought to talking about this rewriting is such a kind of a central part of kind of bringing these two mythic structures in conversation with one another, right? And I'm so kind of, this is kind of one aspect of this, but there's something I noticed about both Falling Crows and Katie Did, right? These two stories in the middle of the collection where you move in time in really interesting ways, you move in point of views in really interesting ways. And I think that there is, in some ways, I think the native aesthetics that you've talked about, but it also, you know, it reminded me very much of kind of the way Alice Munro takes a short story and then makes it big, right? Like where it's an intimate story that feels like it's moving across historical time in different kinds of ways. And I guess my question to you is, are you writing a novel now? Like, what is happening now? Like, what is, if kind of, it's so interesting, right? That you've written short fiction, you've written a play, like, where are you in your kind of genre thinking in terms of what kind of, and you said earlier that now your creative work will be the central kind of driving force. So you don't need to give us details, or you can give us details, but I'm very curious of what kind of, you know, the third part of this kind of triptych looks like, which is the scholarly book, the book of stories, and now what's next?
Okay, so I'll answer very quickly. Thank you for that. One thing is, when I wrote Antigone, I did write it as a story. I never thought about it being performed, but then I did submit it to the Autry, to Native Voices. And so now I'm like workshopping it to become something else, to become a performance. So the current version is quite a bit different from the original, while still sort of, I mean, you know, apparently nobody wants to actually see a Greek play, because people are just standing there talking, just standing there giving speeches. It works on the page, but not on the stage. So I'm trying to revise Antigone for the stage and do some kind of cool things with it. I am writing a novel now, and I published some short stories this summer. And I'm also, you know, I'm very involved in Indigenous language revitalization. And right now I'm working on a book of poems and working with a group, a 7-member group of all Nez Perce language learners and writers. And we're using creative writing for language revitalization. And so I'm writing mostly poems and short form pieces that, like the book, integrate the language, but do it at sort of a larger scale, and actually with the idea of how the whole book will look like from the beginning. So I'm working on all of those things.
Right.
And you tell us, you have another novel coming, or a screenplay, a movie, something.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There's been kind of, you know, there's been movie conversation. You know, there's no kind of, I have nothing really to report, but you know, it's nice. You know, I feel it feels nice that that conversation exists. You know, like it is. You know, I think what you'd said earlier, which is, you know, I wrote Raj because I needed to see Raj on the page, right? I needed to see a failed Indian man. That's kind of full of conflicting emotions and full of all of these different things, right? Like, when Bill Brown says, I knew a Raj in college, and Raj says, yeah, everyone knew a Raj in college. And I think that's actually where this book starts, right? Which is, can I deconstruct the Raj you knew in college, right? And so I think that that's a kind of a part of it, but very much so, like I'm working on a new novel, and of course you think that once you've written one novel, that'll be easier to write another one. And alas, it is not easier. Certain things, but I genuinely, there's some part of me that thought that it would kind of be like a different experience. And it is, in fact, a very different experience. And that's the thing, is right. Like, there's something about the form, any of these forms, that each time you do it, because they're so various, that you have to kind of, the story you're telling demands its own unique form, right? And I think figuring out what that form is going to look like is what is the interesting part of this process, right? How it can serve the theme and the story in different kinds of ways is kind of, so, I'm in the midst of figuring all of that out, but it is nice to have kind of a book on your shelf that you can look to and say, okay, I actually did it once and I can maybe do it again. So that's a really helpful thing to have.
We've got time for a couple more questions, and if anybody in the audience has any, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And for Beth, are there other Indigenous writers you look to for models of how to incorporate Indigenous aesthetics into your work? And are there any other Indigenous writers currently producing work that excites you?
So many. Some of the early Native writers who really inspire me are, Charles Eastman and Darcy McNichol and Zakala Shaw, all of William Appice from the early 19th century. Like, these are all really amazing writers who have written things that are salient today. Contemporary writers, Louise Erdrich is always masterful. Tommy Orange, Sherman Alexie influenced me a lot, has influenced me a lot. Poets, Tommy Pico, Natalie Diaz, Layli Long Soldier, Tiffany Midge is great essayist and poet. There are so many. And I feel like they're all reflecting different kinds of Indigenous aesthetics. Some of them are explicitly engaging their lands, their languages, but also writing about a kinship structure, writing about uncles and aunts. Like, that's an Indigenous aesthetic. There's so many ways to see it. The way people joke with each other, the connections they make. Yes. Native American Heritage Month is coming up in November. So, just pick up a few of these titles. I encourage everybody to.
Yeah, and remember that there is a recording of this also. So on YouTube, you can go back and find that and write down those authors and those books and stuff. Sameer?
Yeah, I mean, I was just kind of listening to Beth. That just sounded like a kind of that's her, Beth, you're like, your contemporary Native literature class is a class I want to take, right? And it is, I mean, that just sounds amazing. I can't remember which story is it that these two characters have a great inside joke about love medicine. Where is that? It's kind of part of what your book also does, right? Which is that it has, I was thinking that, you have this great blurb from Marcus Emerman, who then, of course, appeared. The intertextuality that you have in the book is really, I love that, right? Like, it is, they flow in different ways, right? They're inside and outside the text all at the same time. Lane, I can't remember your question, which was it about kind of the kinds of stuff that I'm reading?
Oh yeah, just any writers that are exciting you right now, or that are influential to you in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting is, I think she's no longer your colleague at Berkeley, but I remember reading this, the Saidiya Hartman book on subjection. And then I just read, I mean, she's had these two new incredible books out, right? About thinking about the spaces in which the archive fails and that it needs to kind of be filled in with different stories. And I think that she's had these two books out about kind of African-American narrative that I'm really kind of keen to look into and keen to read. And I mean, I think what's interesting to me is I was kind of for a different panel on kind of South Asian literature, someone had asked this question, which is, what do you read while you're working, right? And I realized that one of the things that I don't read while I'm writing are contemporary South Asian writers, right? And part of it is that I also feel like I get influenced so quickly, right? That if I like somebody's kind of voice, it's remarkable how quickly that voice will show up the next morning when I wake up to write, right? It happens really quickly. So I think that a part of it, my kind of, the treat for me kind of in this middle period that I'm in is that I can kind of go back to so many of these great, terrific South Asian writers that I have, and particularly South Asian American writers, right? Which is that there has been, this long tradition of kind of South Asian British writers, and of course, for a while, the assumption that all of these books are always about India, right? And I think that what is particularly interesting and exciting right now is that, there's beginning to be kind of, how one might think about like a post-Indian fiction, right? Which is like, how do you write about a place that you have no connection left to, right? And I think that is kind of one of these kind of larger kind of questions that I've been thinking about quite a bit.
So I think on that note, we'll kind of begin to wrap up. I do have, here is, yes. And I did actually, Beth, I had a question about, so I only have, which I meant to bring one home with me from the store, but I just have the advanced reader copy of Beadworkers. But the cover of Beadworkers, so this is a hook for people have to go to the store to it, wherever your local indie is. It really is a beautiful cover, yeah. And
because it's beadwork.
Yeah, and I was wondering, were you involved in that process?
Yes.
Cover?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually thought, the cover of this was the easiest thing ever. Like there's gorgeous beadwork everywhere. And I did suggest like, well, maybe we could use some of Marcus Ammerman's work. And I did think it was kind of funny because he is he's an offstage character in one of the stories, and an artist that I really admire. So this particular piece is really beautiful. I think I may be one of the only authors who says, please judge my book by its cover, because the cover actually does represent so much of what's in the book. Beadwork, the patterns, the setting. It's Mount Hood. So it's an image of Mount Hood in Portland, and then superimposed is an image of that was taken from a photograph of Nez Perce chiefs in 1904. And so the past and the future, the past and the present, the city and the land, the Columbia River, everything, it's all on the same plane there. And then of course, what I love is all the horses and their regalia, and it's like, oh, it's beadwork of beadwork. Just like in the book, there are stories within stories. So I do feel like that image, and this image or this piece of art is owned by the Portland Art Museum, and it's called The Gathering by Marcus Ammerman. And Marcus is just an incredible beadworker.
Very cool. And I have one last question. So we met about a year ago at a dinner at a book industry event. And if I remember correctly, you introduced yourself and the book in Nez Perce. And I'm curious, so the language is scattered throughout the book in the text. Is it represented in the audiobook version of this?
Yes. I actually recorded the audiobook myself because of that. Although I don't, recommend my own voice, but I did. I do. Yes, I read the book in the audio.
Yeah, so that would be another recommended way of taking in these books, and it is on Libro.fm, which you could ask any indie bookseller about, and they would be glad to introduce you all to it. So yeah, with that, Sameer and Beth, if you have anything to add here as we wrap up.
I should say I totally recommend the audiobook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was just a moment of like, I hate the sound of my own voice, but that's not true. The audiobook is awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I just want to, thank you, Lane, and for kind of setting all this up. And thank you, Beth, for inviting me. It was I've been really looking forward to it. And it was such a kind of a nice kind of opportunity to kind of read the book deeply and to kind of be able to engage. I mean, it's so interesting, right? To just hear you kind of talking about the kind of the both the art and then kind of the audio version, all of this stuff together. It is exciting to kind of think about how all of these different artistic genres are kind of coming up against one another in this text. So it's been a genuine pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I am so grateful for your generosity, for the bookstore coalition that invited us, and for the great opportunity to get to have this conversation with you, Sameer. I've always admired you so much, and this is just an exciting moment to get to share together when our books are out now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lane.
Yeah, thank you both very much, and thank you to everyone who was in attendance tonight, and we will see you